For generations, a popular myth has defined the origins of American history. The story usually begins with an Italian navigator arriving on the shores of a pristine, untouched, and completely empty wilderness. But the demographic data tells a different story. By 1492, between 5 and 10 million indigenous people lived in the region that would become the United States. These millions belonged to hundreds of distinct political communities. They spoke hundreds of separate languages, each with its own customs, leadership structures, and ancestral traditions. This vast population was the result of more than 15,000 years of human history. During the last ice age, groups of hunter-gatherers crossed a massive land bridge connecting modern-day Siberia and Alaska, gradually spreading south as the glaciers retreated. To understand the history of this land, we have to look past the discovery myth and examine the ancient, complex world already thriving on these shores. In the forests of the Northeast, societies like the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, built massive, permanent settlements out of heavy timber and bark. They managed their multi-nation alliance through a refined political framework. Decisions were reached through careful discussion and consensus, balancing the strength of a large union with the individual identity of each member nation. 1,000 miles away in the Mississippi River Valley, structured urban centers had already risen and fallen centuries before European ships ever crossed the ocean. The Mississippian culture constructed the city of Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, supporting tens of thousands of inhabitants. Engineering these multi-tiered earthen mounds required immense physical labor and strict central planning. Indigenous North Americans were builders of political alliances, permanent settlements, and monumental infrastructure that rivaled the scope of contemporary civilizations across the globe. In the Appalachian Mountains, communities like the Cherokee generated wealth by actively shaping the mountain landscape for large-scale agriculture. They utilized a technique known as the Three Sisters. Tall corn stalks provided a vertical trellis for climbing beans, while broad squash leaves blanketed the soil below to retain moisture and suppress weeds. This fertile eastern farming contrasts sharply with the arid deserts of the Southwest, where water was remarkably scarce. Here, the Pueblo peoples engineered complex irrigation networks to capture and distribute limited rainfall. This water management allowed them to construct multi-story stone and adobe cities directly into the sheer cliff faces. Indigenous communities actively manipulated and engineered these different biomes, forcing even harsh environments to yield life. These nations were woven together by dynamic trade networks stretching for thousands of miles across mountains, rivers, and plains. Raw copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Atlantic coast traveled through complex exchange corridors. Highly prized turquoise from the Southwest was crafted into refined jewelry and traded deep into distant geographic regions. These same logistics routes circulated agricultural technologies, spiritual philosophies, and oral histories alongside physical trade items. There was also intense competition over limited resources. Rivalries sparked conflicts, but these tensions were managed through shifting alliances, strategic marriages, and diplomatic treaties. By the late 15th century, North America was a landscape of specialized nations linked by diplomatic treaties and continental trade. After 15,000 years of innovation, the North American continent was extensively managed, politically active, and densely populated. Across the Atlantic Ocean, European kingdoms were entering a rapid era of technological expansion. New brass instruments allowed sailors to calculate ocean positions with far greater accuracy. Driven by competition for wealth and prestige, European monarchs pushed their navies further out to sea, searching for faster trade routes to the luxury goods of Asia. These two massive, deeply rooted worlds were operating at the exact same time, completely oblivious to each other's existence. The arrival of 1492 forced a catastrophic collision between two ancient, thriving, and entirely distinct human realities. By the year 1492, between 5 and 10 million people inhabited the region that would eventually become the United States. They belonged to hundreds of separate political communities and spoke hundreds of different languages, a reality that stands in direct opposition to the myth of an empty, untouched wilderness. These populations established deep roots more than 15,000 years ago. During the last ice age, dropping sea levels exposed a massive land bridge connecting modern-day Siberia and Alaska. Generations of hunter-gatherers followed animal migrations across this frozen landscape, moving onto a separate continent. As the Earth warmed and the glaciers gradually retreated, these early arrivals spread southward and eastward. They adapted to dense forests, to vast plains and arid deserts, developing into hundreds of nations, each with their own language and spiritual traditions. By the late 15th century, this land was heavily populated and functioned independent of the rest of human civilization. In the northeastern forests, the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, built permanent homes and forged a sophisticated political alliance. Several distinct nations united under a representative government that relied on consensus to maintain regional stability and cooperation. Near present-day St. Louis, the Mississippian culture constructed an urban center at Cahokia that once supported tens of thousands of residents. To sustain that population, they engineered massive earthen mounds that served as ceremonial centers and symbols of political power. In the arid Southwest, the Pueblo peoples mastered one of the continent's harshest environments. They engineered complex irrigation networks and constructed multi-story homes from stone and adobe directly into the cliff faces. Looking at this map of ancient exchange networks shows the connectivity between these regions. Turquoise from the southwest, copper from the Great Lakes, and shells from the Gulf Coast traveled thousands of miles through organized trade routes. Through agriculture, diplomacy, and major engineering projects, these nations transformed the landscape. They built a self-sustaining world, unconcerned with the kingdoms across the Atlantic. In the late 1400s, European kingdoms faced a severe economic bottleneck. Essential goods like spices and silk traveled from Asia along overland routes, controlled by powerful empires and middlemen, driving prices to unsustainable heights by the time they reached Western markets. This 15th century map illustrates the limits of European geography at the time. Christopher Columbus proposed sailing west, but relied on a massive mathematical error. He underestimated the Earth's circumference, assuming Asia was much closer. Most advisors correctly rejected his numbers, knowing supplies were insufficient, but the Spanish crown decided to fund the expedition. Columbus's voyage functioned as a high-stakes financial gamble to break a trade monopoly. After weeks on the open ocean and cramped wooden ships, anxiety among the crew reached a boiling point. Food and water ran low, and mutiny became a threat, until October 12, 1492, when a sailor spotted land in the Bahamas. The local Taino people greeted the Europeans with curiosity and gifts. Columbus immediately began evaluating the local population and landscape for its economic value, searching for gold deposits to justify the expense of the voyage. When massive reserves of gold failed to materialize, the Spanish forced the native population into the encomienda system, a structure of exhaustive labor. Relations quickly collapsed. The Spanish relied on violence and punishment to maintain control and ensure their economic quotas were met. The moment of contact established a template for an extractive empire, where the original goal of discovery was replaced by a drive for colonization. The most devastating weapon the Europeans brought was invisible. Indigenous populations had been isolated for millennia, lacking natural immunity to viruses like smallpox and influenza. Epidemics tore through villages with terrifying speed, resulting in catastrophic mortality rates. This schematic represents the Columbian Exchange. For the first time, two distinct biological hemispheres linked, triggering a massive transfer of life. European ships carried horses, cattle, and pathogens westward. In return, crops like potatoes, corn, and tobacco moved east to European markets. This biological swap devastated North American populations, while the influx of new crops fueled a rapid population boom across Europe and Asia. Spain's immediate expansion set off a race among rival European powers. Monarchs in England, France, and Portugal realized the immense potential of these territories and scrambled to launch their own expeditions. The Atlantic Ocean lost its role as a barrier, becoming a bridge for conquest and commerce. Spanish dominance in the Caribbean and Southwest inspired the eventual arrival of the French and English, setting the stage for centuries of conflict over North America. The 1492 meeting forced two ancient timelines into a permanent, violent collision. This event shattered the existing indigenous world, setting the stage for the colonial struggle, defining the next 3 centuries of North American history. For generations, history books often began with a quiet, untouched wilderness. The story suggested that when European ships first crossed the Atlantic, they found a vast, vacant continent waiting for civilization to arrive. This data tells a different story. Instead of an empty landscape, North America in 1492 was home to between 5 and 10 million people living in hundreds of distinct nations. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy maintained a sophisticated political alliance. They operated a representative government where member nations reached decisions through public discussion and consensus. Further west, the Mississippian culture built massive urban centers. At the city of Cahokia, tens of thousands of people lived among earthen pyramids that required advanced engineering and a highly organized workforce to construct. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples mastered one of the continent's harshest environments. They built multi-story homes from stone and adobe and engineered irrigation systems to support farming despite limited rainfall. These nations were linked by trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes and turquoise from the Southwest moved through complex networks that connected the entire continent. This was a managed landscape of interconnected civilizations, shaped by thousands of years of human innovation. This leaves a gap in the records. If North America was home to millions of people in 1492, why did English settlers a century later document an empty wilderness? The answer lies in the century following Columbus's arrival. A gap of more than 100 years separates the first Spanish contacts from the founding of the English colonies. During those decades, a continent-wide collision shattered the existing social order, systematically emptying the land before the English ever arrived. When Columbus reached the Caribbean, he immediately pivoted from searching for trade routes to establishing systems for extracting gold and labor. The encounter was the start of an aggressive imperial expansion. Spain followed a specific blueprint for the Americas, driven by the search for gold, the expansion of the Catholic faith, and the pursuit of political glory. In 1521, Hernán Cortés captured the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The fall of an empire to a relatively small Spanish force suggested to Europe that even the most powerful indigenous nations could be toppled. This success sparked a rush of Spanish expeditions. Leaders like Ponce de León and Coronado led armies deep into the North American interior, searching for legendary cities filled with treasure. Long before the British landed at Jamestown, Spain had initiated the military conquest and destabilization of the continent. The soldiers were followed by an even more destructive force. The Columbian Exchange introduced foreign, microscopic pathogens from the Eastern Hemisphere. Because of their historical isolation, indigenous populations had no natural immunity to viruses like smallpox, measles, and influenza. These pathogens moved much faster than the Spanish armies. Epidemics raced inland, leaping across the continent. As the population died, the networks holding these civilizations together dissolved. Trade stopped, leadership collapsed, and ancient alliances fractured. In the 1540s, Hernando de Soto's expedition found evidence of this collapse in the southeast. His soldiers entered once bustling cities, only to find them filled with the victims of diseases that had arrived before the Spanish did. The wilderness, later described by the English, was a landscape in transition. Devastating disease had cleared the land, allowing forests to reclaim fields that had been carefully managed for centuries. Even as populations collapsed, the Columbian Exchange altered the physical environment of the survivors. European plants and animals began to reshape the ecology of North America. To protect their colonial interests, the Spanish established permanent outposts like St. Augustine. In 1565, these massive stone fortifications served as a warning to rival European powers. Beyond the forts, European livestock, including pigs, cattle, and horses, escaped or were traded far into the interior. The horse, in particular, revolutionized life on the Great Plains. It allowed native nations to transform their methods of hunting bison and conducting warfare, giving rise to powerful equestrian cultures. By the start of the 1600s, the continent's ecosystems and cultures had been radically altered by the Spanish presence. When English settlers finally arrived to establish colonies like Jamestown, they were entering a landscape that had already endured a century of crisis. The land they saw was a depopulated and traumatized version of what had existed in 1492. Millions of people were gone, leaving behind a world that seemed quiet and untouched. The English misinterpreted this recovery as the continent's natural state. They saw the regrowth of the wilderness as proof of an empty new world, ignoring the civilizations that had built it. America's history is a record of an ancient civilization surviving a global collision, transforming their culture long before the first English ships arrived. The traditional story of America begins with a quiet, untouched coastline. We often see images of European ships dropping anchor near dense, silent forests, an unpopulated wilderness waiting for its history to begin. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. Between 5 and 10 million people already lived across North America when those ships arrived. They belonged to hundreds of distinct nations, practiced diverse traditions, and spoke hundreds of unique languages. These figures, linked hand in hand on this wampum belt, represent the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy. In the Northeast, they developed a sophisticated system of representative government that relied on organized discussion and consensus building to manage an alliance of several distinct nations. This was a continent shaped by thousands of years of human innovation and political complexity. The modern perception of an empty early America is a historical illusion, one that raises a question about why later settlers perceived the land as a vacant wilderness. To see the scale of these societies, we look to the Mississippi River Valley. This massive earthen structure is the center of Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis. Long before Columbus sailed, this city supported tens of thousands of inhabitants. These engineered mounds served as government buildings and ceremonial centers, rivaling the size of contemporary European capitals. A continental network linked distinct indigenous nations. Copper from the Great Lakes, Gulf Coast shells, and southwestern turquoise traveled thousands of miles. Along these same economic arteries, agricultural knowledge, specifically cultivating corn, beans, and squash, spread, providing the stable food supply necessary for massive urban populations. Within these societies, land was generally viewed as a shared intergenerational resource. This stood in sharp contrast to the European tradition of private property, which focused on the individual's right to buy, sell, and enclose the landscape. Pre-Columbian America was a stable, heavily populated, and interconnected world. The people here had transformed the landscape through engineering, trade, and diplomacy for millennia. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Bahamas under the Spanish flag. He was driven by the intense competition between European monarchs to find a faster, more profitable sea route to the valuable spice markets of Asia. The indigenous Taino people welcomed his crew with food and gifts, but Columbus's journals reveal a different set of priorities. He immediately evaluated the land for its gold and resources, while noting that the local population could be easily forced to work in Spain's interest. The most world-altering force of the Columbian Exchange was a microscopic shockwave. European ships carried lethal pathogens, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the indigenous people had zero natural immunity. In many communities, these diseases eliminated a majority of the population within a single century. Entire cultures disappeared before Europeans ever recorded their existence. These pathogens traveled inland far faster than the explorers themselves. They followed the ancient indigenous trade routes, reaching deep into the continent and collapsing distant political systems long before the first face-to-face meeting with Europeans. When later English colonists described an untamed wilderness, they were observing a post-apocalyptic landscape, a society reeling from the sudden collapse of its populations and systems. The Spanish Empire moved rapidly to build a colonial engine within this fractured landscape. Armed with steel weapons and exploiting the chaos of these epidemics, relatively small Spanish forces overthrew once massive empires like the Aztec. Explorers like Hernando de Soto pushed deep into the North American interior. While searching for gold, they demanded labor and food from indigenous villages, leaving a trail of violence and introducing further disease to communities that had previously remained isolated. To protect the treasure fleets returning from the Caribbean, Spain established permanent military outposts. The massive stone walls of the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine became a center of Spanish power, guarding against rival kingdoms and pirates. Over a single century, Spain redirected the wealth and geography of the Americas, turning this demographic tragedy into the foundation of a global empire. In 1607, English investors launched a different colonial model at Jamestown. Rather than a royal army, this was a private corporate venture seeking immediate profits from natural resources and trade routes. Many of the early settlers were gentlemen who expected to discover easy gold and return to England wealthy. They spent their first months searching for treasure instead of planting the crops necessary for survival. Their failure to prepare led to the starving time during the winter of 1609. Of roughly 500 colonists, only about 60 survived until spring. Historical evidence suggests that in their desperation, settlers ate their horses, leather shoes, and even each other. The project survived because Captain John Smith enforced strict labor requirements and established a precarious trade relationship with the remaining indigenous power in the region, the Powhatan Confederacy. The English corporate model nearly collapsed because the investors completely misunderstood the realities of the continent they were attempting to exploit. The Virginia colony eventually found its financial footing with the introduction of a sweeter, highly addictive variety of Caribbean tobacco. This brown gold generated massive profits, but required vast amounts of labor. As tobacco plantations swallowed up the Virginia landscape, landowners searched for a workforce that could support an aggressive, export-driven economy. In 1619, representatives from across Virginia gathered to form the House of Burgesses. This was the first elected legislative assembly in English North America, establishing the principle of representative government. That same year, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia carrying roughly 20 enslaved Africans. This transaction introduced a labor system that would be codified into law over the coming decades, marking the beginning of African slavery in the English colonies. The United States began within the remnants of ancient indigenous networks and the demographic vacuum left by a biological catastrophe. Its foundation rested on a contradiction: the simultaneous arrival of representative government and the birth of a brutal system of forced labor. Most histories of the United States treat 1776 or 1492 as the starting line. But to understand the actual story of this land, you simply have to look back 15,000 years. This was a continent of 10 million people, divided into hundreds of unique nations. Their trade networks functioned like a continental web, moving copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf Coast to the furthest reaches of the interior. Evidence of this complexity remains in places like Cahokia. This Mississippian city supported tens of thousands of people, managed by a centralized government that could coordinate the massive engineering projects required to build these earthen mounds. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples mastered one of the planet's most difficult climates. They engineered irrigation systems to support agriculture in the desert, and built multi-story stone and adobe settlements that required sophisticated architectural planning. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy pioneered a model of representative government. Their system allowed separate nations to cooperate on trade and defense while maintaining their individual identities, a level of political sophistication that would later intrigue European observers. By the time the first European ships appeared on the horizon, North America was already a landscape of established governments, diverse economies, and ancient religious traditions. Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1492 triggered a biological collision that would eventually reach every corner of the globe. This was the Columbian Exchange, a massive transfer of plants, animals, and people between two previously isolated hemispheres. The most immediate impact was invisible. European pathogens like smallpox and measles traveled along indigenous trade routes, often arriving years before the explorers themselves. Entire communities collapsed, and ancient political structures fractured as populations plummeted. Spain followed this biological shock with a specific colonial blueprint. Their model was state-sponsored and military-led, focusing on three goals: the extraction of gold and silver, the expansion of the Spanish crown's influence, and the conversion of native populations to the Catholic Church. Because their empire was built on wealth extraction, Spain had to protect their treasure fleets. They built permanent military outposts like St. Augustine, using heavy stone fortifications to guard the sea routes that carried gold and silver back to Europe. Spain's arrival also introduced the horse to the North American interior. This single biological change allowed Plains nations to master the hunting of bison on a massive scale, leading to the rise of powerful equestrian cultures that dominated the center of the continent. While Spain dominated the south, they found little gold in the north. Their focus on treasure extraction left the Atlantic coastline open for other European powers to attempt a different approach to settlement. England's entry into the Americas was a corporate venture. In 1607, the Virginia Company, a private group of investors, established Jamestown. Unlike the Spanish model of state conquest, Jamestown was designed strictly to generate profit for its shareholders. This profit-first mindset nearly destroyed the colony. The early settlers were largely gentlemen who refused to perform manual labor. When they failed to find gold and their relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy turned violent, the settlement descended into the starving time, leaving only 60 survivors by the spring of 1610. The colony only survived because of a specific economic pivot. John Rolfe introduced a new strain of tobacco that became an overnight sensation in Europe. As exports boomed, the Virginia Company finally saw a return on its investment. Tobacco was labor-intensive, and as plantations expanded, landowners searched for a workforce they could control. This demand led to the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in 1619, the beginning of a system of human bondage that would grow for centuries. That same year, the colony also established the House of Burgesses. This was the first elected legislative assembly in the English colonies, introducing the principle of representative government to North America. In 1619, Jamestown established two traditions that would evolve in parallel over the coming decades: the practice of democratic self-rule and the introduction of African slavery. The foundation for this internal contradiction was now part of the English colonial model. A third blueprint emerged in 1620 with the arrival of the Pilgrims. These religious separatists were not seeking gold or corporate profits. They were searching for an ideological refuge where they could worship outside the authority of the Church of England. When they landed in Massachusetts, outside the territory of the Virginia Company, they faced a legal crisis. To maintain order, the men aboard the ship signed the Mayflower Compact, a brief document that would serve as their framework for self-government. The compact established a revolutionary political idea: that a government's authority should come from the consent and cooperation of the people it governs, rather than a distant king. Despite this political breakthrough, the Pilgrims nearly collapsed during their first winter. Their ultimate survival depended entirely on the Wampanoag Confederacy and a native man named Squanto, who provided the diplomatic and agricultural knowledge the English lacked. Plymouth offered a model of colonization built on family units and shared religious discipline. Instead of corporate extraction, they focused on localized agriculture, fishing, and community stability, creating a template that would soon bring thousands of other Puritans to New England. By 1630, English settlement was no longer a desperate experiment. It had become a permanent expansion based on these two distinct models, one driven by profit and the other by ideology. By the late 1600s, the landscape of North America reflected the priorities of the people who settled it. European livestock grazed on former indigenous hunting grounds, and colonial towns were connected by trade networks that moved both tobacco and religious ideas across the ocean. This map shows how those early strategies began to overlap. You had the Spanish model of imperial conquest in the south, corporate plantations of the Chesapeake, and religious refuges of New England. These overlapping systems created a profound tension defining the American identity. The same societies that pioneered mechanisms for self-governments and religious refuge were built upon the displacement of indigenous nations and the expansion of human bondage. modern America grew out of the collision between established indigenous nations and the expansionist goals of European empires. To understand the modern United States, we must look at the framework established by these early blueprints. The cultural and political identities they created continue to shape the nation today. In 1630, thousands of English citizens fled religious pressure in their homeland, seeking a total break from the past across the Atlantic. John Winthrop, the leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, envisioned this new settlement as a city upon a hill. He believed that if they built a faithful, disciplined society, the entire world would look to them as the ultimate example of Christian success. The stakes were presented as a binary choice. If they succeeded, they would glorify God across the globe. If they failed, they would become a worldwide symbol of shame and a warning to all future believers. Unlike the earlier trading posts populated by young men seeking quick wealth, this new migration consisted of entire families. Communities arrived with their ministers, craftsmen, and teachers, ready to build permanent infrastructure from the moment they landed. To reach this utopian goal, every member of the colony had to move in perfect unison. Private life and public devotion were inseparable, meaning that any individual who deviated from the communal plan was viewed as a threat to the survival of the entire mission. This focus on communal discipline led to rapid growth and high literacy rates. Because the Puritans believed every person must read the Bible to be saved, they founded Harvard College just 6 years after landing to ensure a steady supply of educated ministers. This meeting house illustrates how civic and religious life were physically joined. Within these walls, church attendance was mandated by law, and the same leaders who delivered sermons also drafted the colony's legal codes, making spiritual obedience a requirement for secular citizenship. This structure faced a challenge when a minister named Roger Williams began to publicly argue that the government had no authority to police religious belief. He also claimed the colony had no right to land that hadn't been fairly purchased from Native Americans. In 1635, the colony's leaders banished Williams. He traveled south and founded Providence, establishing a new colony in Rhode Island, where the government and the church were kept strictly separate, allowing Baptists, Quakers, and Jews to worship freely. Soon after, Anne Hutchinson challenged the ministers again. She hosted religious meetings in her home, arguing that individuals could experience God's grace directly without the total mediation of the church hierarchy. Just as they had with Williams, the authorities expelled Hutchinson from the colony. These early trials established a pattern of conflict between the demands of the state and the religious convictions of the individual. The very pressure the Puritans applied to maintain their city upon a hill acted as a catalyst, forcing the creation of new, more tolerant colonies by those who could no longer live under their control. Outside of New England, the geography of the South, Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, dictated a different path. Vast river networks and a warmer climate supported an economy built on large-scale agriculture. This chart shows how the export volumes of tobacco, rice, and indigo grew over the century. As these crops generated massive wealth, political power became concentrated in the hands of the planters who owned the most fertile land. Between these regions lay the middle colonies. New York and Pennsylvania became known as the bread colonies, producing the vast quantities of grain needed to feed the growing Atlantic world. Pennsylvania was the site of William Penn's Quaker experiment. Unlike leaders in other regions, Penn made a point of negotiating land purchases with Native American nations, rather than simply claiming territory by right of the king's grant. This plan of Philadelphia reveals the highly organized grid that Penn designed. The city's predictable layout and the colony's policy of tolerance made it one of the most rapidly growing commercial centers in North America. Though their motivations differed, every region discovered that long-term prosperity required a constant and aggressive acquisition of new land and new labor. As the colonies grew wealthier, the cost of that growth became visible. The need for more farmland meant the borders of the colonies were constantly shifting. As settlers pushed westward onto land occupied by Native American nations, this competition for territory transformed the frontier into a site of violent displacement. At the same time, the plantation economies in the South were facing a massive labor shortage that European immigration could not satisfy. To maintain their profit margins, colonial planters increasingly turned to the institutionalization of racial slavery, resulting in the transport of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The rapid rise of these 13 colonies was not a standalone success. It was a transformation made possible by the displacement of indigenous peoples and the expansion of human chattel slavery. By 1700, the 13 colonies were diverse, populous, and increasingly connected to global trade networks. Because 3,000 miles of ocean separated them from England, the Crown often left these colonies to manage their own affairs, a period of relative isolation that lasted for decades. During this time, local colonial assemblies took on the daily tasks of government. They raised their own taxes, passed their own laws, and organized their own local militias to protect their borders. After generations of managing their own budgets and security without royal input, colonists began to view these powers as a permanent right. The act of self-governing had transformed from a local necessity into a standard expectation. In just 70 years, the colonies had developed the political habits of an independent nation, but they had hardwired those habits into a society built on systemic oppression, setting the stage for the internal conflicts that would follow. For generations, European maps labeled North America as a blank slate, a wilderness waiting for discovery. But long before those ships crossed the Atlantic, millions of people had lived here for more than 15,000 years, building hundreds of distinct nations linked by trade networks that stretched across the continent. In the Mississippi River Valley, the city of Cahokia supported tens of thousands of inhabitants. Its people engineered massive earthen mounds to serve as ceremonial centers and symbols of political power, requiring the kind of organized, large-scale urban planning seen in the world's great ancient capitals. Farther west, the Pueblo peoples constructed multi-story stone and adobe homes in one of the continent's harshest environments. They mastered life in the desert through sophisticated irrigation systems and careful settlement planning, thriving in a landscape with almost no rainfall. The arrival of European explorers was a collision with an ancient, highly developed world that had already been thriving for thousands of years. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Bahamas while searching for a faster trade route to Asia. His voyage triggered the Columbian Exchange, unleashing a wave of Spanish conquest reaching from the Caribbean deep into the North American mainland. These expeditions unknowingly carried viruses like smallpox and measles to populations with no natural immunity. Within a century, these epidemics eliminated a majority of the indigenous people across the Americas, causing a demographic collapse that cleared the way for further colonization. Spain secured this new wealth by building military outposts to guard its shipping lanes. The massive stone walls of the Castillo de San Marcos in Florida stand as a reminder of how Spain established permanent military and administrative control over the coast. At the time England entered the race, they turned to private investors rather than royal armies. The colonies they founded would spend the next century building the architecture of representative democracy. At the same time, they were engineering a system of total human subjugation. In 1607, English investors established Jamestown in Virginia. The colony barely survived its first years, nearly collapsing from disease and starvation, as settlers lived in these crude, thatched-roof huts and searched for gold that didn't exist. Stability finally arrived with the cultivation of tobacco. In 1619, as the colony expanded, representatives from across Virginia gathered to form the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative assembly in English North America. To the north, the motivations were different. The Pilgrims and Puritans who established Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay were driven by religious conviction, seeking a place to worship according to their own conscience rather than seeking profit. Before even landing in 1620, the men aboard the Mayflower signed a compact to create fair laws for the good of the colony. It was a milestone in political thought, establishing that a government should exist through the consent and cooperation of the governed. Dissident thinkers soon pushed these boundaries further. In Rhode Island, Roger Williams established a refuge for complete religious tolerance, arguing that the government had no authority to interfere in matters of faith. By the mid-1600s, the English colonies had successfully planted a working model of self-governance and liberty on American soil. But this success had a hidden cost. During the earliest years, the colonies only survived because of indigenous diplomacy and agricultural assistance. learning how to plant local crops and navigate the landscape. As the population grew, the European concept of private land ownership drove relentless westward expansion. This resulted in brutal conflicts like King Philip's War, which destroyed dozens of towns and effectively ended organized native resistance in southern New England. In the southern colonies, the economy grew around large plantations. Cultivating tobacco and rice required an immense, exhausting amount of labor that landowners were unwilling to perform themselves. The arrival of enslaved Africans in 1619 marked a turning point. Over the following decades, colonial laws were systematically rewritten to strip away their rights and create a permanent, hereditary system of chattel slavery based on race. This demand for labor fueled the Middle Passage, a forced migration of millions across the Atlantic. Men, women, and children were packed into the holds of ships and transported under horrifying conditions to serve an insatiable economic machine. The economic prosperity of the colonies relied on the systematic destruction of native sovereignty and African liberty. By the 1750s, the 13 colonies had become an economically powerful network. A distinct American identity was emerging, fueled by high literacy rates and a growing sense of independence from the British Crown. This map illustrates the geographic spread of these colonies by the mid-18th century. Moving inland, settlers entered a high-stakes competition with the French Empire. Meanwhile, as Enlightenment ideals circulated in the north, southern colonies passed draconian codes to tighten control over enslaved populations. The history of these 13 colonies is defined by these two competing realities existing in the same towns, the same laws, and the same years. To understand the future United States, one must recognize that its foundation was poured with two permanently entangled forces: a hunger for liberty and an unrelenting capacity for exploitation. Many history books still open with the image of an empty North American wilderness, a pristine landscape waiting for European arrival. In reality, the continent was a crowded map of hundreds of unique nations. These civilizations were linked by vast trade networks and complex political alliances that had existed for thousands of years. Evidence of this sophisticated urbanization remains at Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. These massive earthen mounds once formed the center of a city that supported tens of thousands of residents, housing the government buildings and ceremonial centers of the Mississippian culture. In the arid Southwest, the Pueblo peoples engineered multi-story stone and adobe settlements. They mastered one of the continent's harshest environments through complex irrigation systems and careful urban planning. By 1492, millennia of human innovation and agricultural engineering had already defined the North American landscape. The landing of Christopher Columbus in 1492 set off a biological collision known as the Columbian Exchange. This historical illustration documents the arrival of invisible pathogens like smallpox and measles. Lacking any natural immunity, indigenous populations faced catastrophic mortality rates as these epidemics swept through their villages. The loss of life was so sudden that it fractured long-standing political alliances, killed key leaders, and caused entire trade networks to collapse. Reports of the resulting gold and silver flowing back to Spain ignited intense competition among rival European monarchs who were eager to claim similar wealth for themselves. This demographic collapse, paired with the promise of immense riches, created a perceived power vacuum that pulled competing European empires into a race for the continent. While Spain relied on royal armies to extract gold, the English model focused on private investors and religious groups looking to build permanent, self-sustaining communities. The Jamestown colony, founded in 1607, was a commercial venture that nearly failed because the early settlers prioritized the search for treasure over planting crops. By 1620, the Plymouth colony established a different path. These families were driven by a quest for religious freedom and the right to govern themselves according to their own conscience. Both settlements relied on indigenous knowledge to survive their first years. In Virginia, the Powhatan provided essential food, while in New England, Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to navigate the landscape and use fish as fertilizer for their corn. English survival was finally secured when John Rolfe introduced a sweeter strain of Caribbean tobacco to Virginia. The crop became an instant, highly profitable export. The success of tobacco and family-run farms proved the English model could endure, eventually leading to the creation of the first elected legislative assemblies. However, this prosperity locked the colonies into an economic engine that required constant westward expansion. Tensions were driven by a sharp disagreement over how land should be used. English settlers believed land should be fenced and privately owned, while native nations viewed it as a shared resource entrusted to each generation. Because tobacco quickly exhausted the soil, planters demanded new territory. This pushed English borders west, onto native lands. This relentless expansion sparked King Philip's War. The English victory destroyed hundreds of native villages, displacing surviving populations. At the same time, the plantation economy faced a critical labor shortage. The existing system of English indentured servants could no longer keep up with the scale of production. Colonial leaders turned to the Atlantic slave trade, establishing a system of hereditary chattel slavery. By the late 1600s, laws were systematically rewritten to base human ownership entirely on race, making the status of enslaved people permanent. This created the central paradox of early America. The growth of elected government and economic success was achieved through the forced removal of native peoples and the racialized enslavement of Africans. By the mid-1700s, maps like this recorded the dense plotting of English settlements along the Atlantic. The population had grown to over 1 million people, who were increasingly accustomed to managing their own local affairs through their own assemblies. This contrasted with the French imperial model. New France had a much smaller population and focused on vast territorial control, using a network of forts to secure the lucrative fur trade and maintain strategic alliances with native nations. The collision point was the Ohio Valley. English speculators and settlers began moving into the region, directly challenging France's claim to the interior of the continent. The demographic momentum of the British colonies made a large-scale conflict with the French Empire inevitable. This 1750 map shows the massive stakes involved. The French and Indian War, which began in 1754, forced Britain to dedicate thousands of soldiers and massive financial resources to secure control of the continent. During the struggle, colonists realized they needed to cooperate for their shared defense. Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die cartoon was a public call for the colonies to act as a single, unified body politic. Britain won the war and claimed dominance over North America, but the victory left the British government with a massive national debt. The cost of conquering the continent, combined with a growing spirit of colonial unity, created the exact conditions that would soon tear the British Empire apart. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, North America was a landscape of millions of people. It was a continent of thriving civilizations and vast trade networks. Settlements like Cahokia featured earthworks and engineered geometry that rivaled the urban planning of major cities in Europe and Asia. For thousands of years, the populations of the Americas developed in total isolation from the rest of the world. This separation meant indigenous communities lacked any prior exposure to the specific livestock-borne pathogens common in Afro-Eurasia, leaving their immune systems unprepared for a biological encounter. When Europeans arrived, they brought viruses like smallpox, measles, and influenza. These pathogens moved faster than the explorers themselves. Epidemics pushed deep into the interior, and in many regions, 9 out of 10 people died before they ever saw a European face. The exchange worked in reverse across the Atlantic, carrying American crops like potatoes and corn back to Europe. These calorie-dense staples could thrive in poor soil, fueling a population surge in Ireland and Central Europe that saw numbers double or triple over the next 2 centuries. European explorers entered a continent in the middle of a demographic collapse. By the time they established permanent colonies, the biological chain reaction had already dismantled the power structures and population centers they would have otherwise faced. Spain established the first massive footprint in North America, following a strategy of direct conquest. They sought out centralized wealth, established a chain of Catholic missions, and built heavy stone fortifications like the Castillo de San Marcos to defend their territorial claims from rival kingdoms. While Spain tried to control its borders, it could not control its biology. Spanish horses escaped into the interior and spread across the Great Plains. Native nations like the Comanche and Lakota adopted these animals to expand their hunting ranges and revolutionize their military tactics in the span of a few generations. Over a century later, England utilized a different model along the Atlantic coast. Instead of deploying royal armies, the English crown granted charters to private investors. These joint stock companies recruited entire families to build permanent farming communities, aiming for corporate profit rather than simple territorial defense. Since London was thousands of miles away, these settlers had to manage their own survival. To maintain order, they drafted agreements like the Mayflower Compact, establishing a habit of local self-governance and democratic consent that operated almost entirely outside of royal control. In Virginia, the settlement of Jamestown only survived because colonists began growing a sweeter variety of tobacco. European demand for the crop grew rapidly, creating a profitable export that required vast tracts of new land and an unending supply of physical labor. Planters initially used English indentured servants, but as the tobacco economy grew, colonial leaders sought a more permanent workforce. Following the arrival of captive Africans in 1619, Virginia began rewriting its laws to create a rigid, hereditary system of racial chattel slavery to fuel its agricultural engine. This diagram of a British slave ship shows the mechanical cruelty required to sustain this economy. Captive men, women, and children were packed into cargo holds to survive a journey across the Atlantic, providing the forced labor that made the southern colonies some of the wealthiest in the British Empire. The need for more tobacco fields pushed English settlements further west, into lands occupied by Native American nations. This expansion triggered violent resistance, leading to conflicts like King Philip's War, which resulted in the widespread displacement of indigenous peoples throughout New England. By the early 1700s, the colonies had reached a level of prosperity and independence that rivaled parts of Europe. Yet this success was built upon a foundation of stolen land and forced human labor. As colonial populations multiplied, settlers pushed over the Appalachian Mountains, colliding with a different empire. France controlled a massive fur trading network stretching from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, and they claimed the Ohio Valley as their own. Neither empire would back down. What began as a localized border dispute in Pennsylvania escalated into a global superpower conflict known as the 7 Years' War, involving battles from the Caribbean to India. To defend themselves against French forces, colonial leaders recognized they were too weak as individual entities. Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die cartoon urged the colonies to coordinate their defenses, marking the first time the separate colonies began to consider a unified political identity. To secure the colonies, the British government committed thousands of regular soldiers, along with massive financial resources, to the war effort. The British Navy established a blockade of French shipping, and infantry units pushed into the interior to systematically capture French forts. The 1763 Treaty of Paris formally ended French rule in North America. France surrendered almost all its territory east of the Mississippi River, leaving Great Britain as the undisputed European power in the region. But the victory was a financial disaster. Britain had borrowed enormous sums to win the war, and the government was now struggling with a national debt that had nearly doubled. Officials in London expected the American colonists to pay their share of the defense costs. To prevent expensive new wars with native nations, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists were forbidden from moving west, and they were suddenly hit with new taxes to pay off the debt. For over a century, Britain had allowed these colonies to develop their own laws, economies, and governing traditions. By suddenly imposing new taxes and physically barring westward expansion, London forced 13 separate societies to find common cause against their own king.